And in the news in this last week, we saw that Donald Trump's new social network received a legal notice from an open source software developer saying that they were not complying with the terms of the open source license.
Welcome to the Contract Teardown Show from Law Insider, where legal experts tear down contracts from some of the most well-known companies and high-profile executives around the world.
In this episode, Matt Newsom, software developer turned lawyer, tears down the general public license. Most open source coders rely on this document to create new software, and getting it wrong may mean having your political social network taken down, as a random, totally relevant example. So let's tear it down. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Contract Teardown Show from Law Insider. I'm Mike Whalen. The purpose in this show is exactly what it sounds like. We take contracts, we beat them up, we are occasionally nice, but most often mean, because it's funnier that way. Today, I am with my smart buddy, Matt Newsom. Matt, how are you today?
Hey Mike, great. Nice to talk to you.
It is good to talk to you, Matt. We are doing something weird today. I feel like this show has become here's the standard thing, and every episode we're doing a new weird thing. Hey guys, today we're doing a new weird thing. We've seen some things in the news Matt has noticed, and we're going to talk about some public licenses. We're going actually through several documents, but let me give you an example real quick. This is the general public license, and we're going to talk about iterations on this and application to a current drama situation that's super fun. So, Matt, before we dig into this thing, what is it? Give us the trailer version, the short version of what we're looking at today.
Well, a lot of software that's used on the internet and our computers and our phones is released under an open source license. And in the news in this last week, we saw that Donald Trump's new social network received a legal notice from an open source software developer saying that they were not complying with the terms of the open source license. So I thought we could talk a little bit about what happened there and what these open source licenses do and how to stay compliant with them.
Cool. And before we do that, tell us about you. What's your background? What brings you to documents like this and the kind of choices that these software companies are making?
Sure. Well, I'm a relatively new lawyer. I spent the first half of my career as a software developer working for some high-tech startups and in some cases, open source software companies. So I've got about 20 years experience developing software and working with licenses like this.
Got it. So to make it easier for everybody else that's watching, I'm going to ask you to do what you did for me earlier and explain this a little bit like I'm a child. And what I'm going to do to sort of frame this is share something that you shared with me, which is Instagram's reference to these public licenses and sort of ask you, in the software development process, what is the relationship between existing code and code that Instagram is creating, and sort of how does that lead into these different licenses that we're going to talk about today?
Sure. Well, if you are making a new app or any kind of software-based product, it takes a lot of work. And so most companies now prefer to use some software that other people wrote, and they incorporate that into their own. And sometimes they buy that software, and sometimes people generously make it free. And that free software is usually called open source. When Instagram uses open source software in their mobile app, they have to comply with a licensing agreement. We see that right here. They're using some software called FFmpeg, and they're telling you, hey, we're using it, and this is why we're using it, and this is what you can do if you want to use it.
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking about this like if you want to create an Apple app, for example, you go onto their developer library and you're going to use a bunch of stuff that already exists and sort of iterate on it. Or if, in my case, I have a WordPress website, I don't start from zero coding a website. I am old enough that when I was in school, we did the zeros and ones, like I legit coded stuff from zeros and ones when I was in elementary school. But now, nothing's really starting from scratch. And so there is this issue of the licenses and what you're allowed to do. And we'll talk about what all those are, and then we'll tie it back into what's happening with former President Trump and his new social media platform. But let's start here, Matt. I'm looking at the GNU General Public License. This one is coming from Toshiba product, it looks like. Tell me about this, the GPL, what it is. Frame this issue out for me.
Sure. Now, if we can go back in time a bit, in the 70s, when computing was just starting to catch on, you couldn't walk down the street and buy software. There was no internet. You couldn't download software. And to make matters worse, there was really no standard kind of computer. People were building them in their garage. And so if you wanted to have a program on your computer, you would probably write the program. Now, I'm old enough that I remember getting magazines that had programs in the magazine. And then what you would do is, if you wanted to use the program, you would just type the program in and hit the run button. And then it never worked on the first try, but after some tinkering, it would finally work. The problem is, let's say that you came up with a great idea and you put it in the magazine, and some person in their garage typed your program into their computer and ran it, and then they used that, and then they made $1 million or $100 million, and it was mostly based upon what you did. How would you feel about that?
Yeah.
And some people would say, "Oh, that's awesome. I'm so glad of your success." And some people would say, "Well, I kind of like a piece of that."
Or if Matthew Broderick accidentally launched a bunch of missiles, you'd also want to know whose fault that was. But yeah.
That's true. So when you use software that was just shared like that, you really didn't know what your rights were, or what you couldn't do, or who was at fault if somebody launched a nuclear warhead. And so open source licensing became a thing. And this was basically a way to just clarify what you can and can't do with a license. And I'll just say that there's a spectrum, and on either end, you've got some people who just said, do whatever, maybe just give us credit. That's it. We don't care. If you make $1 million, we don't want it, but, tell everybody that we helped. And those are very permissive licenses. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we see a more restrictive model. And this model basically says, we want this software that we've developed to stay free. You can use it, but you can't bottle it up and prevent other people from using it. And in fact, if you add to this software that we've made, then that also has to be free. So if you make any changes to it, you've got to share your changes. And those licenses are called viral open source licenses, because any code that gets added to the open source code becomes kind of infected, which is kind of a negative sounding word, but contaminated or whatever, with this open source license, and then becomes open source. And that's a problem for some companies, because, like Instagram, if you download the Instagram app, does Instagram want to make all of Instagram free? Well, no, probably not. And so that's why it's important to know what these licenses say.
Hey everybody, I'm Mike Whalen. I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Contract Teardown Show. Real quick, I want to ask you to do me/you really a quick favor. Look down below. You'll see a discount code to join the Law Insider Premium subscription. When you do that, you get access to more content like this. You'll see webinars, daily tips on contract drafting, not to mention access to the world's largest database of sample contracts and clauses. It will help you write better contracts faster. If you want to do it right now, there's a code below, so get there. Also, if you're part of a larger team, if you're in-house or in a law firm, just email us. We're at sales@lawinsider.com. We'll make sure you get a deal as well. Come join us in the community. The code is below. Let's get back to the show. Right. So looking at the GPL, is this the sort of the first or an early iteration of trying to formalize the permissions that used to be, let's just toss it in a magazine?
Yeah. And the GPL that's in use today is version 3. And so it has changed over the years, and it's a very solid license. And it very clearly says that if you're going to use this open source software code, and let's just put a name to it. Let's use WordPress, for example, because WordPress is licensed under the GPL, the GNU public license. And so if you make a new product that has WordPress or any part of WordPress in it, then you'd have to say, by the way, we used WordPress in this code. And so you have to just acknowledge that.
Got it. All right. So take me through what kind of permissions is the GPL allowing that got, it looks like, if I'm understanding correctly, that this was an original license, the GPL. What were sort of the permissions that was allowing that later got, I think you mentioned to me in preparing that there was a bit of a loophole in there, and then they had to get the later iterations to sort of clean that up. Can you explain that to me?
Sure. So the company that produced the GNU public license, the GPL, they are called the FSF, the Free Software Foundation. And it is not just a license. It is an ideology. And in the ideology, they say all software should be free. And so they list 4 software freedoms that you get. And I should probably just quote those. Mm.
Yeah, and so these principles that you're looking at, I'm just going to share this with the viewers. This is a quick guide to GPL. It's a document by Brett Smith that sort of gives the foundations of this and what the principles are that GNU is using. But anyway, go ahead and talk us through those. What are those principles that you mentioned?
Sure. There's the 4 principles that are the foundations of the GPL and the Free Software Foundation, and that is the freedom to use the software for any purpose. And so that means that you can take the software code and you can inspect it, use it for educational purposes, you can sell it, you can do whatever you want. And then the freedom to change the software to suit your needs. So if you don't like it, you can change it. And then you also have the freedom to share the software with your friends and neighbors. And so if you see something that you like, now this was a controversial thing that Bill Gates spoke out against in the early 80s, that if you are using software licensed and under this license, you are totally allowed to share it with people. And then also you get this 4th freedom, the freedom to share the changes that you make. And so if you decide to change it, in some cases, you might be in a legally gray area. But if you start with software that's licensed under the GPL, you will clearly have the freedom to share your changes. And then they label software that has all 4 of these principles embodied as free software. And it's not just free as in zero cost, because you are permitted to sell it. It's free that you can do whatever you want with it.
Got it. Okay, so cool. So now root me back in a document. Take me to one of these. You gave us some sections from Law Insider. I've got one that I mentioned from Toshiba. I've got one from a wiki from a company, MyAkitio. Tell me about, root me back in a document. Tell me how these kinds of licenses work in practice in a document.
Sure. So one of the fundamental concepts that you're going to do with software that includes software from the Free Software Foundation, so GPL-based software, is you're going to first of all need to acknowledge that that you're using someone else's software. Then depending on which license you're using, you have the GPL or the L or the lesser GPL or the AGPL. Then you need to follow some additional provisions. And how about we start with the LGPL? This is the lesser general public license, and the Free Software Foundation encourages people not to use it, which is kind of interesting. The reason why is because you don't get all of those 4 principles when you release your software as LGPL, and yet it's the one that is most interesting to commercial companies. Yeah. So Instagram is using software to display images. So part of the graphics that you see in Instagram, that part is done using free software. If Instagram didn't like something that was going on, then they would have, if they wanted to make a change to that open source software, then their changes would become open source. They could contribute those back to the FFmpeg community. But if they make a change to software outside of that small component to the rest of their app, the rest of their app does not have to be open source. And so they get to use the open source software freely without it fully contaminating their code. So their code can be licensed under a commercial license, and the free part, the little sliver that gets added on, can be licensed under an open source license.
Got it. So you gave an example of a document from a company called CalRec Audio Ltd, and they make reference to this LGPL. in section 2.4 that we'll share with people. The language that, what you're trying to accomplish, if I'm the drafting attorney, the language that goes into a section like this, is this language that I'm pulling from GNU, or do I as a drafter have to figure out how do I phrase this in a way that protects my client, that makes clear what it is that we're using this for, right? I guess what I'm worried about a little there is a lawyer like me going in and go, I don't know what the heck any of this stuff is. How do you, maybe this is a big picture question, but how do you incorporate that technical know-how that's required to write this in a protective way and the legal know-how to write that in a protective way? What kind of teams maybe would you build to try to write this kind of language, or is there just standards that you can pull from GNU and similar kind of language?
Well, the Law Insider product is actually pretty handy because you can do a search in Law Insider and you can see dozens of examples of other companies and how they've done it. That said, if you have a background in intellectual property or technology licensing, then this is going to be very standard stuff for you. You're going to be familiar with the language. Even if you haven't used open source licensing in the work that you've done in the past, this is a well-written software agreement, so you'll be able to figure this out. And if you do not have IP-based background or a software licensing or technology licensing background, then it's probably worth talking to a lawyer who has it just to get clear. Because, we'll talk about in a moment here, I think, what happened to Trump. And you'd want to avoid that happening, which is getting a takedown notice or a cease and desist notice because of the improper use of the open source software.
Got it. So if I'm understanding correctly, there's broadly some choices as to which kind of license you're talking about. You've got the GPL that you talked a bit about, the LGPL, and I know you wanted to move to what in your email you referred to me as the fun one, because all of this is fun, the AGPL. Tell me about that jump and what the AGPL does.
All right, so let me tell you the problem with the GPL that is seen in the eyes of people who love the GPL. And that is this. The GPL kicks in when you distribute software. And it doesn't matter if you distribute the source code or if you compile the code into an app and you share the app. If you distribute the source code, then the GPL becomes active. If you just download it to your computer and play around with it and you just say, oh, cool thing, and don't distribute it, well, you haven't done anything that activates the viral nature of the GPL. And so the internet really allowed a great big loophole to appear, because if I write software and put it on my server and nobody actually downloads the software, then have I distributed it? Some people would say yes, but a lot of people say no. So for example, if I use WordPress on my website and then I make some changes to WordPress that just affect my website, then arguably I haven't actually distributed my software. And so I don't have to make my changes open source. And if you wanted to protect those 4 freedoms that we talked about before, then you would say, well, darn, you just violated the whole guideline, the principle behind our licensing agreement. And that's why the AGPL was created. The AGPL is more restrictive in that little loophole. If you make a website that is based upon AGPL licensed open source software, then that AGPL licensed software, that AGPL software license becomes active as soon as you make it available for other people to use.
Got it. And you gave us an example from a German company, MetaWays, of a document that incorporates some of this AGPL language. This closed distribution license agreement, did you have anything to add about this particular document and how they use these sort of licenses and the choices they're making?
Yes. Now, this company is very clever. Now, there is a good reason why commercial companies like the AGPL. Now, let me just say this, that there are major Fortune 500 companies who make a ton of money by giving software away for free. And I'll just point to Red Hat as being a big example. Red Hat software develops software for enterprises, and they give it away free. Anyone can go download the source code and do what they want with it. And so that's how their business model works. A lot of companies, they make software for sale. Either they give it to consumers or they sell it as a service, this SaaS premise, right, which is big these days. A lot of companies benefit by having a try it before you buy it system so that they can let people use the software on their own servers without having to buy it. MetaWays did something interesting. They have a dual license for their software, so they can sell it as closed source proprietary software, or they can give it away for free as AGPL licensed software. Now, the beautiful thing is that if anybody downloads the open source free version, then it automatically contaminates their server and it is open source. And in addition to not being supported, that they give a great incentive for companies who do not want to release their own software as open source to skip the free version and instead go buy the enterprise version, which is obviously not going to be free. And so they've done a dual license. And if you've written software, you're allowed to do that. You can say, I'm going to give it away for free or sell it. And if you buy it, you get these extra features. And one feature could be a license that doesn't attach to your changes that you make.
Got it. Well, I'll tell you what, this can be overwhelming, obviously, for the lawyers who are watching this, who are doing the drafting. What we're going to do is include a bunch of links in the post for this conversation over at lawinsider.com/resources. We've got examples of the different licenses in use, the GNU pages where they describe the purpose in the licenses. But what I want to ask you to do is step out a little bit to this experience that maybe explain to us, if I understand the story correctly, former President Trump decided to create a new social media platform on the back of his complaint that social media platforms are against him or something. And so he's created this new platform. And in doing that, his team didn't want to start from zero in coding, so they used some previous code language. Did they use it correctly? Did they not? They've since gotten in trouble. And I guess my question to you would be, who screwed up, do you think? Is this a failure of the software team? Is this a failure of the legal team? How can you avoid this kind of screw up in the drafting and in the decisions about what software to use in a company?
Sure. So let me just tell you what happened here. Creating a social network from scratch is a big deal. Twitter is a pretty amazing piece of software, and they've been working on that for a good 12 or 13 years now, and it's still not perfect. So starting from scratch is really not feasible for a lot of companies. The software community has created a few tools so that you can just download and run your own Twitter-like social media network in a couple hours, and that's amazing. And you don't even have to pay for it. In this case, the software that Donald Trump's team used is called Mastodon. And Mastodon is a turnkey system. You just download it, install it, and it's ready to go. And it's a beautiful thing. The problem that they ran into, and this is the problem that a lot of people in the world run into, is they didn't look carefully at the license, and they didn't understand what their requirements were for a license. This is why we have jobs, folks. This is why we as lawyers get to do what we do. And it's our job to kind of protect the people who are using free open source software to make sure that they comply. If an attorney had looked at this software and inspected it, they would say, all right, team, this is what we need to do. We need to, first of all, acknowledge that we're using free software that is licensed under the AGPL. We need to acknowledge that we're using Mastodon. And then second of all, if we make changes to the software, then we need to make sure that our changes are shared back to the community. And they could do that in a number of different ways. They could contribute their changes back to Mastodon directly. Mastodon develops their software in the open, which means anybody can volunteer and contribute. And so they could have just given their change software back to Mastodon and be okay with it. Or if the Mastodon community wasn't interested in that, maybe the changes were too unique or special to just this one product, then they can just package their changes and say, if anyone wants to know what we've done, here you go. You can look at it. And then, and that's really the major thing that they had to do to comply. You need to read the license to see this, but it's not that hard. And when we were talking before this phone call, you said, does the free software community, does the Mastodon software, do they get to say, no, we don't want Donald Trump to use our software? And the answer is no. The terms of this license means that anybody can use it. You don't have to agree with anyone's worldview to say that they can use the software. As a matter of fact, if you don't mind linking to the blog post in the blog in your notes, the Mastodon community, they overtly said, we don't like Donald Trump. We don't really like what he's trying to do with the social network. But they say, but that's not our place.
Right.
We released it into the open, and anyone can use it.
Right. Yeah. Either it's open or it's not. So, for you, the lawyer, maybe largely what we're doing with this episode is signaling to you, these are dangerous waters, right? Like you can really feeling like, you're copy pasting language from somewhere to be able to turn that language into something that your team can use, that they know what to do, the compliance involved in that can actually be a pretty big project. So maybe largely what we're doing is telling you, red flag, give Matt a call. Matt, if people want to do that, if they want to reach out to you and learn more about how to use licenses like this and your work, what's the best way for them to contact you?
You should go to my website, which is iowabusinesslawyer.com. I joke on LinkedIn and say that I'm the geekiest lawyer in Iowa, and I haven't been disproven yet. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn there. Just look up my name and you'll find me, the geekiest lawyer in Iowa. But, that's really a great thing. And, I think any lawyer out there who's looking at this, or if you're a technical or legal enthusiast and you want to use open source software, the beautiful thing is that these open source licenses are really not that difficult to understand. You can read them and understand them. The Free Software Foundation has made guides available so that people can comply with this. It was written for technical people to understand. And so complying with it isn't hard. It does take a little work, a little bit of reading, but you can do it.
It is not hard for the geekiest lawyer in Iowa. We appreciate you, Matt. We'll make sure to have your contact information and all the documents that we've talked about wrapped up in the post that will be at lawinsider.com/resources. And as always, if you want to be a contributor on the Contract Teardown Show, just email us. We are at community@lawinsider.com. You'll get to talk to us, share your ideas, beat up documents, even if I don't totally understand what the heck you're talking about with all the zeros and the ones. Matt, we appreciate you. We'll see you guys in the next episode. Y'all have a good day.